Record, and we're good to go. Good evening. We are going to continue on this journey. It really is a journey. The topic of Chassidut. I have many pages of notes, information to share with you. As I said before we started this section, we're probably looking at least a month, probably more, on all this stuff. Bezrat Hashem. And hopefully this week we won't get interrupted by a siren. We'll see what happens this week. It's always an experience. So we shall see. There's 2 times they had sirens while I was teaching, and both are this class. Okay, so where we left off last time was the basic background to Chassidut, its early time, and what its tenets were. We really didn't get very much into too much depth yet, because before we do that, we have to talk about the opposition and the controversy to this birth of this new movement. We said that Baal Shem Tov did not start off trying to make a movement of some sort. It happened organically, fairly quickly, on the background of very many bad things that had happened in the past 100 years before, and at the same time, that reform and revolution were happening in other parts of the world, especially Europe and the United States, what would become the United States of America. So during the lifetime of the Baal Shem Tov, he wasn't still as widely known as you might consider, but it was his disciples, his students, that for the most part made his learning, his teachings become very popular. But the opposition, and we'll see who and why and what, began to grow fairly quickly once his words were starting to be spread. Especially under the leadership of the Vilna Gaon. We're going to talk about him in a moment, because it was seen that Chassidut was a dangerous deviation, quotes, from Torah, from tradition. The Baal Shem Tov's original teachings were far from that. There was no look to try to abolish halacha, to change anything like that, chas v'chalila, but rather to deepen the spiritual experience within it. I mentioned at least 1 or 2 times along the way when we were talking about both Yaakov Frank and Shabtai Tzvi, the false messiahs, that one of the main underlying fears that kept creeping up in the early days of Chassidut was, here we go again. We had a man who thought he was Mashiach, and a lot of people believed him. He converted to Islam. We had another person who thought he was Mashiach, and a lot of people believed him, and he had an ignoble ending as well. His wife tried to continue, and that didn't go very well, and it pretty much became a subset of maybe Christianity. But in order to understand what the Vilna Gaon had against Chassidut, and I'm going to give you like a point by point and hopefully a little bit of depth for each one, we need to understand who he was himself. Who was the Vilna Gaon? So what we're going to do is we focused last week on the Baal Shem Tov and some of the early teachings. This we're going to focus on the Vilna Gaon and hopefully get to his opposition. Now, in Hebrew, lehit naged means to oppose something. Benigud le means as opposed to. Neged means against. So we get the term mitnagdim or misnagdim, and the term means the ones who are against. So if a person doesn't know the background to what misnagdim or mitnagdim were or are, it's really were, then the term is, it doesn't mean anything. You'll say, there's the Hasidim and there's misnagdim. But what does that mean? It's like saying, let's say 1,000 years from now, it's the Tzionim and the anti-Tzionim. What does that even mean, right? Hopefully by then we're all going to be Tzionim. It's okay. Mashiach will be able to explain it to everybody and set everybody straight finally. Anyways, so we're going to meet the Vilna Gaon this evening. Why do I say it like that? It's what's the word I'm looking for? It is been said many times. I know there's a word I'm looking for. I can't remember it. It's been said many times that somebody like the Rav Soloveitchik Zatzal would say that when he was learning the Rambam was right there with him. He saw the Rambam Kilu, he was there, and he was almost having a conversation with him. And I've always looked at when we learn history, you're not just learning some facts and figures, because I said that's not who I am. I don't do that. But we get to understand a little bit about the personality, the person's background, the sviva, or the context in which they grew up, and that, of course, helps to inform on their outlook in life, and then that would then be the reason why X. So we're gonna go down that path. Vilna Gaon was zoche to be known. Now let's go back a second. Sorry, I mentioned Rav Soloveitchik. So in the United States, when you say the Rav, it means Rav Soloveitchik. Here and there, when you say the Rabbi or the Rebbe, you mean the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Zecher Tzadik V'Kadosh Livracha. When you say in halachic terms, when you say in the Ashkenazi world, especially, you say the Gaon, you mean the Vilna Gaon. Now, the reason that's important to point out is during this class many months ago, we talked about the various time periods starting from after the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. There was the Tanaim, Mishnah, Amoraim, the Gemara, Savoraim for about 100 years. And then we had to come to a period of a number of hundreds of years of the Gaonim, like Amram Gaon and Hai Gaon. We talk about all of them. So that was that was more of a title. The word Gaon means genius. But back then, when you talk about the Gaonic period, that was more of a title. I'm sure they were all very smart people. The Vilna Gaon was called this because he became known, as we're going to see in a moment, to be known as a genius. How genius? So first of all, just to put it in context, he's born in 1720, dies in 1797, which at that time period, 77 years old to die, was pretty old. And again, putting it in context, he lives during the time of Shabtai Tzvi, and just after Shabtai Tzvi, during the time of Yaakov Frank, the American Revolution, the early part of the French Revolution. All this is going on in the same time as him. One of the reasons I point this out, besides putting it into historical context, is that when I was growing up, I believed, no one ever told this to me, this is what I thought, was that the only people in the world, the Jews and the Egyptians. There was nobody else on earth. It was just us. And the whole world revolved around Egypt and the Jews being in Egypt. I never understood, and when I did start teaching history or Jewish history many, many years ago, it only occurred to me then, see, I wonder what else was going on in the world. I mean, by then, of course, I knew there were more people, but turns out that Yitzchak Avinu and Hammurabi, as in the Code of Hammurabi, were contemporaries. Chances of them ever having meeting, I don't know, but they were contemporaries. So understanding where he is, because again, keeping in mind, this is why it's important to know he's dying during the time of the American Revolution, the French Revolution. That's in the back of his head too. Besides what seems to be this new revolution of Chassidut, but I don't want to jump ahead. Let's go back. Let's go back to the beginning. He is the number one greatest scholar of all time in the mitnagdim world, meaning the non-Hasidic world. You can make an argument that he's probably the greatest one. It is his customs that most of Ashkenazi world will follow. He had a very deep-seated position to, as we said, to the birth of Chassidut. And we'll come to that, but let's learn a little bit about who he was. His name was Eliyahu ben Shlomo Zalman. He's known as the Gra, the Gaon Rebbe Eliyahu. So if you go to Yerushalayim and you go to the Gra's Shul or Nusach HaGra, what is that? It's HaGaon Rebbe Eliyahu. That's what it stands for. It's the Chupchik. It's a abbreviation. His name again was Eliyahu ben Shlomo Zalman. He was born in Vilna, hence the name, the Vilna Gaon. That's like who's buried in Grant's tomb, which was part of the Lithuanian Commonwealth at the time. His father, Reb Shlomo Zalman, was himself a Talmid Chacham. His mother came from a scholarly family. But if you want to know what it means, genius, okay, listen to a couple of facts. Firstly, he was known as having an encyclopedic memory and extreme independence of thought. Now, usually that kind of stuff, a person's smart, it starts coming out at a certain age. Yet at the age of, sitting down, 7 years old, he already was delivering shiurim, advanced shiurim and Gemara and Halacha. By the time he was 11 years old, by which time I'm just trying to figure out which side of the paper I'm supposed to write on, the Vilna Gaon had already mastered the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Talmud Bavli, the Rishonim, the poskim that were available until that times, most of Tanakh, Medrash, math and astronomy books that had been available. In other words, he knew everything. He knew everything. By the age of 11 years old. Now, you put a parenthesis here for a second. And we talked about this when we learned Tanya. This is one of the things I like to do, kind of weave different topics into, mix topics together because you kind of connect the dots. You say to yourself, like, that's not fair. Like, how does that happen? Right? How come some kid struggles until he's finishes? Today I did testing in school for English bug group. Some kids walk in, boom, 1, 2, 3. They're non-English speakers, and they just go with it. They just knew it. Others are struggling with every single word. And other kids say, we all know, whether it was ourselves or friends of ours who were when we were in school, that there was one kid in my class, but when we were learning by 8th grade, I'd say, he was already known he was very smart before that, but by 8th grade, when we learned the Gemara, he would ask the question Tosfos asked. When we learned the Tosfot, he would ask the Rush's question on the Tosfot. When we learned the Rush, he'd ask, it was like we just sat there just like with our mouths open. Like, what are you smoking? Him nothing, but maybe others were. But in any case, so it's like, why did I have to struggle, let's say, to remember all these things? Like, you can sit down with me and teach me the periodic table, the oxygen, the helium, and plutonium, and all that. You could teach me from now to doomsday. Which is not probably a good word to use when you talk about the periodic table. It's not going to sink in. I'll know a few of them. I've tried to learn many times, started to learn Kabbalistic stuff, and with it was very basic, and some of it sticks and some of it doesn't stick. And there are people, I mean, put the Vilna Gaon aside, that like it comes to them easily. It's not fair, right? So the answer is it's not. Who said life is fair? Tanya talks about the fact that when Hashem sends the Neshamot down to this world, that certain people get a special neshama. Hashem needs certain special neshamot to be in this world in order to be a Vilna Gaon, or a Moshe Feinstein, a Lubavitcher Rebbe, and the list goes on. And even the Satmar Rebbe, and how much I would disagree with so much of what Satmar stands for, obviously, but Torah is Torah. And the brilliance of Torah, and the Chassam Sofer, and all, just the geniuses over the centuries. But he was a special genius. He's the one who has the moniker Gaon when it really meant. Sometimes you go, especially here in the United States, go to a wedding, they start calling up people to a bracha to the chuppah. We're going to ask Rav Moshe Levenstein, the Gaon, Rav Moshe Levenstein, come up. I'm just making the name up, to give bracha chita. What made him a Gaon? I was sitting next to my Rebbe Zatzal, to Rabbi Gedaliah Schwartz at a wedding one time. And it's exactly was this. Every rabbi was being called up as Hagaon this, Hagaon that. And he turns to me and said, I guess we're back in the Gaonic period again. He was the history made, that was his life in addition to Torah. So he was the Gaon. So when you talk about in halacha, well, that's what the Gaon said, or we go by the Psak of the Gaon. We're talking about the Vilna Gaon. You would think that he would be a chevraman. He'd be out there and he'd be teaching and trying to get thousands of students on, but it was exactly the opposite. He actually went into almost complete seclusion, uninterrupted Torah study for decades, not months, decades. And he would come out sparingly. So people hear that, well, did he daven the minyan? Oh, yeah, I'm sure there's a minyan by him as well, but he sat Yom and V'layla and studied. He did not, it's a word I didn't get to use very often. I think it's right. He eschewed. He didn't want to do. He refused positions of communal leadership, rabbinic positions. He wanted to influence through scholarship. He wanted to influence through his Torah, not becoming a rabbi of his community or anything like that. He very often studied alone without a chavruta, because it helped him to have a very intense focus on what he was learning. His approach to Torah was itself revolutionary. Remember, I'm not throwing that word out lightly. We have to keep remembering the time period we're in. It's a revolutionary time period. America, Europe, Judaism, it's all happening. His Torah approach, both in terms of its depth, its breadth, precision, he was very much about what does the text mean. Now, I'm going to stop here for a second and make something very clear. And by the way, that's called pshat. There are four ways to look, generally speaking, there are four ways to look at Torah. Pardes, Pei, Resh, Daled, Samach. Pshat, Remez, Drush, Sod. Pshat means, what does the pasuk mean? I'm going to give you an example of all these partially. Remez means it's a hint. The pasuk says this, but it's hinting something else. Drash, homiletics. And Sod is secret, which means Kabbalistic approach. I have lots of problems with many different educational things that are given to our students, our kids. One of my favorite classic ones is when the kids, say they're in Kita Gimel or something, maybe around that time, and they learn Parshat Shavua, and says that Miriam put Moshe, her brother, in the Nile, in the basket, and says that the daughter of Paro saw the basket, but tishlachet hamata. So the meaning of the pshat is she sent her maidservant, her amma. The drash is she sent out her amma, meaning her hand. This your middle finger in Hebrew is called your amma because the length of an amma, a cubit, is this length. So it says that Rashi says, and others say that she miraculously stretched out her arm to teach us all kinds of ideas and stuff. And they all come home with the picture drawing with a long arm of the baby Moses in the basket and all. Yes, that's nice, but what's pshat? What's the psukim mean? And this, unfortunately, transfers into time when people are learning in yeshiva and beyond. Go to the average yeshiva, ask a guy sitting and learning Gemara for years or months or whatever it might be, generally years, and he's reading the Gemara, and it quotes a pasuk, and the Gemara is giving a drash, and what this means is at Shabtot Tishmo Mitzvot. Okay, and say, okay, what's the pasuk mean? And they give you what the Gemara tells you, or they tell you what the Toso tells us what it means, or what does the pasuk mean? That's first. It's an expression. Eina pasuk yotzei midei pshuto. The first thing you have to know, what does the pasuk mean? It doesn't leave. It still has a meaning by itself. When it says ayin tachat ayin, an eye for an eye, it means that, but it doesn't mean that in the legal sense. But we have to understand the idea of quid pro quo, whatever it might be, but understand the words. What is ayin tachat ayin? Mamo, money. Yes, but that's what we learn from it. It's not what the pasuk means. This is what he focused on, pshat, and that he focused on across Talmud, halacha, Torah, Tanakh, and he was also actually very deeply committed to Kabbalah, especially the Lurianic Kabbalah, which we've talked about at length, the system of the Arizal. His decisions in halacha. Let's back up. At some point, probably when I was teaching about the time of the Amoraim, the Gemara, I probably mentioned this mashal or this parable I've used before. When I teach kids, especially when I teach kids Gemara, which isn't very often anymore. When I teach kids Gemara, I will very often especially when I used to teach girls Gemara, I taught them separately, but in Chicago, but very often I get the question, I don't understand. Rav and Abaye, they're always arguing. Rav and Shmuel, they're always arguing. Would they just choose what they're going to do? I said, you mean, do you feel like they have a giant dartboard? They say, you said asur, okay, I say it's mutar. You say it's no good, I'm going to say it's okay. You say it's treif, I'm going to say it's kosher. You think that's how they approached halacha? The answer is obviously not. They had what's called a derech. They had a way in learning, and they had approach to, in Shammai and Hillel, the best example, that they had an approach to halacha. So when you talk about, and by the way, the same thing is true when it comes to interpretation of Torah. The Ramban, Ibn Ezra, Rashi, Sforno, Meshachach, just go down the line, and each one has a certain approach to Torah and how they look at it. If you want to know, let's say, like a grammatical issue in the pasuk, just jump to the Ibn Ezra very often. If you want to know more about a deeper meaning, jump to the Meshachachma. Every one of the Parshanim, the commentaries, have a derech, a way that they try to draw within their lines and not to go into other people's yards to play with other people's toys. And the same thing is true when it comes to someone like the Gaon. his halachic decisions were marked or whatever by a few things. First, we're talking now only 150 years, I think, at the most, almost a couple hundred years after the invention of the printing press. Still, probably majority of what's available at that time was handwritten. Remember, it's in the 1500s that the first book is printed by Gutenberg. We know it's a Bible. I actually was just teaching this yesterday to a kid. And before I told him it was the Bible, it was the first thing printed. I said, what book do you think he printed first? So he gave me some funny answer. I don't remember what it was. I said, I'll give you one hint. It's the book that's printed more than any other book on planet Earth. He says, I have no idea. So I told him it's the Bible. And I looked in Google, 5 billion copies of the Bible printed every year. 5 billion. That's a lot of books. It's the word. It's the book of Hashem. At least the first part is. I don't know about that other new stuff. In any case, I mean, I do know about it. So he would go through the Gemara as an example. He said, this isn't right. This doesn't make sense. This is wrong. And if you open a Gemara, you will find Hagaot Hagra, the emendations, it's a fancy word, of the Vilna Gaon. It's usually in very cryptic, a bunch of abbreviations. He'll say something like, I'll make up a word. Let's say this word, Hachanami, which means also here. And meant it was supposed to be something else. And it's supposed to be Hatamnami over there. And you'll see the emendation side, and he'll say something in abbreviations. Lamed, I'm making this up now. Lamed Dalad, Kama Vav Sham. Okay, what's that mean? So you have to know how he wrote. He wrote in shorthand and then it changes the text. That's one, because he believed there were any printing mistakes and written mistakes, scribal errors, I guess you call it. He often wanted to go back to original manuscripts and early sources, he didn't trust modern technology of printing presses because it was still a human being that still had to set the type. Wait a minute, that people wrote, it was kitvei yad, there was handwritten, there's even maybe more chances of mistakes. That's true. But the earlier the source, the more close to the original it is, and therefore we would favor it more. When he came to halachic decisions, he would not be bound by a decision that's already recorded as halachic decisions when he felt that it was based on a flawed reading or minhag. What does that mean? Let's say, the other day I was just mentioning in a couple places, in my Pirkei Avot class, at least there and somewhere else, that there's a halacha that most people don't seem to know. It's minor, but it's a halacha. It's brought in Shulchan Aruch that when Hagba is done, when they pick up the Sefer Torah and Shul, that the custom is to use your pinky and point at it, but the halacha is you're supposed to bow. The face, or the words of the Torah facing you, you're supposed to bow. It's halacha. Okay. Let's assume, I'm making this up now. This is not what I'm about to say is not true, but I'm making it up. Let's say, for example, that the halacha said that you're supposed to stand at attention, and by a mistake of a one letter, they came down. You're supposed to bow instead of stand at attention. He said that in spite of the fact that for centuries we've been doing X, it's based on a mistake, and therefore we're not going to do that. We're going to change it to this. And there are many minhagim. I've actually given shiurim on this. What I call minhagei shtut or minhagei ta'ut. Minhagim, customs that are born out of mistake, or customs that are born out of foolishness. I'll give you one example of a mistake. It's not really a mistake. It's born out of not reading the room, as they say. There's a very wide custom among Ashkenazim. When you take the Torah out of the Aron Kodesh on Shabbat morning, you face the people, you say Shema, and you say two psukim, and then what do? The Chazan turns. You see it in many Sidurim. It says the Chazan turns around, faces the Aron Kodesh and bows, and then goes to take the Torah. I found a source, and I've looked for it. I've seen it twice with my own eyes, and I never remember to find it to go look for it again. Where did that come from? So there used to be the Sidur for the Chazan, even though there's big Sidurim for Chazanim now. We used to be much. Actually, the show by me in Chicago, we used to have a huge. It's like you can't see it on the screen, but it was very large. And the Chazan had the Sefer Torah, and he had the big giant Sidur. So now, what's he supposed to do? He's supposed to take the Torah to the Bima. But he's not going to walk with a Sidur. So what does he do? He turned around, put the siddur down, stood back up. People watching said, "Oh, that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to face the Aron Kodesh and bow," and that's how minhag is born. So these kind of things is what he, at least in the halachic sense, I don't think he would say don't do that because there's nothing wrong with it. It's just not, whatever. But when it came to halacha, he was willing to say it's wrong based on his reading of the text of earlier years. His students codified many of his rulings and his perspectives, but like I say, he never held a formal office. He wasn't like the rabbi of Vilna or something. He was not. What were his fields of mastery? So you can basically say everything, but let's kind of catalog it here. Talmud and Halacha. His comments on the Shulchan Aruch. Also, when you open up a Shulchan Aruch, I'm not talking about Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah is written by the Chafetz Chaim. I'll explain to you why I'm telling you that now. It is written by the Chafetz Chaim. It is on the first chelek of Shulchan Aruch, the Orach Chaim, and is basically usually published in 6 volumes. Why am I going out of my way to mention that the Chafetz Chaim wrote the Perush? The Chafetz Chaim wrote the Mishnah Berurah. My own personal experience, and I know I've told the story for people who've never been in my classes before. This will be a first you're hearing that. With other people, you probably forgot, so I'll tell it to you anyways. In my second year in Yeshivat Shalavim, we were going to be learning Masechet Shabbat, which turned out to be the first Masechet I ever finished, beginning to end. And I asked one of the older guys, he was probably 19 or 20, what should I learn as an introduction to Hilchot Shabbat? He says, well, why don't you just learn the Chafetz Chaim's introduction to Hilchot Shabbat? So I said, cool, where am I going to find that? He said, well, just open up the 3rd volume of the Mishnah Berurah. And I said the following sentence: why would the Chafetz Chaim write an introduction to the Mishnah Berurah? And the guy started laughing. He says, that's cute, that's funny. I said, I don't know what you mean. What are you laughing about? He said, you don't know that the Chafetz Chaim wrote the Mishnah Berurah? I said, no. So he was in shock. I mean, I went to Yeshiva Day School, I went to high school. He ran and got me a copy of the Mishnah Berurah. He opened up the front cover. It says, with the note written by Rav Yisrael Meir Kagan of Radin. That's the Chafetz Chaim. Oh, kind of like, I guess I was absent that year. So when I say that when the Gaon wrote emendations and commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, you won't find them in the printing of the Mishnah Berurah, but you will find them in a regular Shulchan Aruch that has the Shach and the Taz and the other commentaries whom we've learned a little bit about in the past. And it's called the Biur Hagra. Same thing. He also has lots of Rashi Tevot, of abbreviations, and it's not always clear what he's trying to amend. When it came to Tanakh, one of his things was dikduk. Actually, it's dikduk, grammar. He wrote a commentary on Mishlei, Kohelet, and Shir HaShirim, which, by the way, if you're not aware, are the 3 books of Tanakh that Shlomo HaMelech wrote. Just as an aside, and I've done this with other groups, your homework is Mishlei starts off Mishlei ben David. Kohelet starts Ani Kohelet ben David. I am Kohelet son of David. These Mishlei, the parables of son of David. And Shir HaShirim starts off Shir HaShirim Asher Mishlomo. He mentions David's name in the introduction to Mishlei and Kohelet, but not Shir HaShirim. Why? We'll see. You can let me know. Anyways, so he wrote what's called a super commentary. What is a super commentary? Super doesn't mean it's great. It means it's on top of another commentary. We know that Rashi is a commentary, the classic commentary on Chumash and other things. There's a commentary called Mizrahi. And it's not a political thing. Mizrahi wrote a commentary on Rashi. I don't know if this is true or not, but he's probably, if not but one of the first commentaries on Rashi. The equivalent of what's bothering Rashi, what was Rashi thinking, what's the problem here. So that's called a super commentary. Super means on top of. It's a commentary on a commentary. So he did that. He wrote super commentaries on Mishlei, Kohelet, and Shir HaShirim, and he brought in things besides Dikduk I'm talking now. He also brought in things from the Midrash and Kabbalah and linguistic approaches to the words that are appearing in front of us in the Tanakh. He was an unbelievably rich language. It's the language. It's the Lashon HaKodesh for many reasons. Kabbalah. He was also known as a great Kabbalist. He saw it as essential and not optional. I mentioned earlier that I've tried a few times to listen to learn. I have a couple of books I've learned with them, but listen to Shiurim online for Kabbalah for Dummies, the equivalent. Not really, it's not what it's called. Shiurim both in English and in Hebrew, introductions and backgrounds and all. And one shiur kind of took me a little by surprise. And he said that people think that Kabbalah, meaning like Zohar and other things of that nature, that's a nice add-on. It's not the main. It's not important. It's if you get to it, great. If you don't, you don't. He says there's a chiyuv. You got to learn it. It's part of Torah. So I mean, I guess I still have a long way to go. But in any case, the Gaon saw, and this is his approach, is essential. It's part of being Jewish. It's part of being what your corpus of your Torah needs to be. Now, if you're going to say to me, wait a minute, I don't even know Tanakh. I still working on Parshat Shavua, or I can get through a little Gemara, but I can't even read Rashi. Fine, put a Kabbalah aside. It's not important like that. Okay, you can't. With no names, I've had over the years a couple of people who've come to me and asked me shilas, religious people, Torah baits, everything that have to do a lot with Christianity and insights into how this would work in with Judaism. And I told them, if you were as good at studying into depth the Jewish sources as you are the Christian sources, you'd be a Talmud Chacham. So my point being here is that people try to, in 12-step programs and addictions, there's something called two-stepping. Like you start, you accept that you're powerless over whatever it is, and all of a sudden you jump to step 12 or a different step, and you say, okay, I'm ready to help everybody else there is. You don't do that. You can't do that there, and you can't do that when it comes to Torah. You can't say, okay, now I know Parshat Shavua, I'm ready to learn Kabbalah. It doesn't work that way. You have to build up. And that's also something that the Gaon was very strong on. He was also a genius, as I mentioned before, in sciences, math, astronomy, geometry, geography. How do we know, by the way? Okay, it's nice to say that, but how do we know that? From his writings. Not his writings, his students who wrote down what he said, because he wrote almost nothing himself. I can't say he wrote zero, because I don't know that for a fact, but I can tell you he wrote almost nothing. So his students wrote a tremendous amount, and it had to do with astronomy, geometry, geography. I'll give you one example of how we can see the genius. When you have a moment, and if you don't have the Rambam, the Yad HaChazakah, which is known as the Rambam, Mishnah Torah at home, just go online, open up the halachot of Kiddush HaChodesh, the sanctification of the new moon. And I'm not talking about the Motzei Shabbat after the third or seventh day of the Molad. You say Kiddush HaChodesh or Birkat HaLabana by Sfaradim. I'm talking about the real original recipe, where witnesses would go out, they'd see the new moon, they'd run to Sanhedrin and all. I have had the zechut of going through the whole Rambam, and I will tell you honestly, when I did that section, I just read it. I tried to understand what he was saying. Yeah, he's talking about this constellation when this is this perspective and this is this angle, and it is mind-blowing what the Rambam was, and the Gaon was on top of that even. I'm going to many years later, obviously 600 years later, approximately 500 years later. But his genius is seen in his writings. That's how we know the genius of the Rambam as well. He also is actually amazingly good at at world history chronologies. But he would connect midrashic sources to historical reality. Imagine, it's 1,000 years from now, and you hear a story about a man taking a flag of Israel. And right now it's 1,000 years later, it's Mot HaMashiach, everything's great, where everyone's actually, there's Achdus and everyone's wonderful, it's peachy keen for centuries already. But you hear a story about a man who took an Israeli flag off of someone's car and broke it apart. Like, what does that have to do with anything? Why would someone do that? Until you understand what was going on historically, the Tzioni, anti-Tzioni, so you kind of put it into perspective. I've heard this from other people. Now, this isn't my example of, again, jumping 1,000 years from now. What do you mean that there was a machloket, whether you said on Yom Ha'atzmaut, if you would say Hallel, not say Hallel, say it with a bracha? What was the reason behind it? Again, you'd have to understand in context why people have different opinions on it. And that's one of the things he was a genius at as well. What about his relationship with his students? Remember, I told you we're maybe going to get some of his opposition. We'll see. We'll still have a little bit more to talk about him because it's important to know who we're talking about. In spite of the fact that he was in relative isolation for a large part of his life, he still was surrounded by a small group of elite students. Many of them became, I guess, for lack of a better term, his torchbearers. And they founded I don't know if I'm making this word up or not, but a mitnagdic Lithuanian jury. A Lithuanian jury of mitnagdim included names that you may know. At least one of these you're going to know. Reb Chaim of Volozhin, he's known as the one who founded the Volozhin Yeshiva, the mother of all yeshivot, every yeshiva that exists today, pretty much, in the style of a regular quote unquote yeshiva, started itself off in its foundation, which was Reb Chaim Volozhin. We're going to talk about him when we get to him. Reb Menachem Mendel of Shklov. He was one of the key editors of the Gaon's writings. Rabbi Yisrael of Shklov also wrote another sefer called Be'at HaShulchan. This was through them and many, many other students. The Gaon's derech was institutionalized. What does that mean in normal English? For about 2 years. Some of you know I get a new siddur almost every year or two for various reasons. But one of my many siddurim when I was davening Pesach Ashkenaz was the Gaon siddur Hagra, which by the way is fabulous because in among the other things there's Ba'aseh Harav, which means there's stories about the Vilna Gaon, things he said, and explanations of davening. It's truly a fantastic siddur. If you don't have it, get it. It's worth it. Even if you don't daven from it, it's good to learn from. But we have what's called like the Gaon's derech, how he approached things. If you're familiar at all with the world of Brisk, which is a world we're going to have to talk about at some point, the Brisker Rav, there's the Brisker approach to things. I'm not going to explain this right now, but if you know what it means, you know what it means. There's a Chetzon Gavra thing, and there's just so much that is connected to a certain derech for different Gedolei Yisrael over the centuries. So his derech, the Gaon's derech, became institutionalized, and there's a better word than that, especially within the Lithuanian yeshiva tradition. Among the people that were most influenced by this and by the Gaon, as I just mentioned, was the Soloveitchik family, the Beis Halevi, Chavetz Chaim. They all have their background with the Vilna Gaon derech. So a lot of what you see, and then they forge their own way, but a lot of their original thinking and their approach to life, their approach to halacha, very much stemmed from the Vilna Gaon. I want to talk about one last thing, and I'm not going to get into the opposition tonight. I thought I might, but I'm not. And that has to do with a little known story or attempt by the Gaon to make Aliyah. In 1780, he started to try to make Aliyah on his own, probably with his family, I imagine, but basically himself, not taking a cadre of people with him. He got as far as the city of Königsberg, and for whatever reason, it's not known, he decided to turn back. Evidently, it was never fully explained, but he believed that he wanted to go to Israel because it was the Mashiach, time of Mashiach. I'm only guessing that maybe for whatever reason, he came to the conclusion, oh, wait, it's not Mashiach time, and there's no reason for me to go. I don't know. But he did have a belief one of his main approaches in life when it came to that topic was active redemption. What's active redemption? The exact opposite of a large percentage of our fellow Jews. Passive redemption is, I'll make Aliyah when Mashiach comes, because why should I go? Mashiach's not going to bring me there. Or we don't go. That's not, we're needed in Chutz La'aretz. That's approach. That's fine. That's. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I have a different approach. That's passive redemption. The redemption is going to come. Active redemption is we do things to l'karev the Mashiach. We do things to try and bring Mashiach here. So the more Jews and more Jews and more Jews that come to Israel, maybe Hashem will finally say, okay, my kids are home. Okay, let's have a party. But he doesn't make it. Instead, following his death, many of his students, known as the Cubs, not the Chicago Cubs, the Gurim, I think they were called. I forgot that. Anyways, they were called the Prushim. Also, those who separated themselves, they did make Aliyah. I don't remember the exact number. It wasn't huge, maybe 100 something. I have to look it up. I don't remember. And they, for the most part, settled in Tzfat and Yerushalayim. And they were the ones instrumental for the most part in reviving the Ashkenazic presence here in Israel. Vilna Gaon passed away in the middle of Tishrei, the 19th of Tishrei, obviously right before Sukkot, or probably for him, Sukkot, in 1797. He was 77 years old, and he's buried in Vilna. And his burial site is I've been there, is a place where people go. It's a pilgrimage site. He has left us a legacy. That's one of the things I love in teaching all these things in Jewish history when we talk about people. We've seen how Rashi, the Rambam, Rav, Shmuel, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, how they have had influence onto us literally to today. And same thing is true with the Gaon, that his textual precision, his intellectual integrity, his spiritual depth, everything else, that while he published very little while he was alive, all the posthumous works, everything that came out after he was dead, made a tremendous and continued to today making a tremendous impact on the learning of Torah. There isn't a base medrash that's worth its weight that people are learning in, that every single day somehow the Gaon's name is not mentioned, whether it's his commentary on the Gemara, commentary on Navi and Torah, whatever it might be, somewhere along the way the Vilna Gaon's name is mentioned, or at least his work. Okay, so now that we talked about who he was, next week, Bezrat Hashem, we could talk about, so what was this problem with Chassidut, or as we maybe say about Rashi, what's bothering the Gaon? Okay, so we're gonna have to wait till next week to see that. Bezrat Hashem. In the meantime, let's hope for some good news. Bezrat Hashem, and we need a lot of B'sorot Tovot. That's all I can say.